And I truly believe that if Bitcoin is able to sustain its trajectory, we're going to see hundreds of trillions of dollars leave these traditional asset classes and move back into Bitcoin. Bill Gates, he talks about kind of depopulation. Canada had the trucker rally, people had their bank accounts freeze for simply protesting. So if that's deemed a free country, I think we've got a very skewed idea about what free means. But it made me really realize how much the political environment basically dictates whether or not you're going to live long term in a country. I would say that the biggest thing that Bitcoin does is
we live in a system of broken money. We're given the illusion of freedom. We're attacked, programmed, and misinformed by mainstream media. Unelected organizations, they govern global finance. How did we get here? What's the fix? Joining us today is Seb Bunney, author of The Hidden Cost of Money, co-author of Beers for Bitcoin, co-founder of Looking Glass Education, which was founded with Greg Foss and Daz Bea. Today, we have a huge dive into the psychology of money, the hidden cost of money. So, Seb, welcome back to the show. Well overdue. Let's do a giveaway. But before we do that, how are you today?
Oh man, it's honestly a pleasure to jump on again. I really value all the content you kind of put out there, Sean, and I really value just kind of the ethos behind it. And so I'm looking forward to our talk.
Mate, thank you so much. And thank you for all the value that you've put out. Hidden Cost of Money, Beers for Bitcoin. Nearly every day I'll bring up Beers for Bitcoin. It's a great first start. And then to dive into the psychology of money, which is something that we're going to get into today, I want to dive straight into chapter 10, which is the illusion of freedom. How do unsustainable systems erode our rights and our freedom? I guess that's a lot to unpack, but how would you start that conversation? What is the illusion of freedom? Why do we think we have it? And how do we actually not have freedom in the world? Why are we not sovereign individuals?
You know, this is a huge question. And I would start with the quote that's at the start of that chapter, which is, "In the age when all grand ideas have lost credibility, fear of a phantom enemy is all that politicians have left to maintain their power." And this is by a guy named Adam Curtis. And I think that the world in which we live in today, unfortunately, we live in this kind of debt-based inflationary world. And because of how much debt we have, if the system collapses, those in positions of power lose that power. And so in order to be able to continually limp along, we see increased regulation, increased infringements on rights and freedoms. And so as society has progressed, as time has gone by, we have seen our ability to show up authentically and our ability to do the things we want infringed upon. And I think that you don't need to look too far, but all of these events, whether we're talking about like the war on drugs, whether we're talking about the war on terrorism or the great financial crisis or the pandemic, they seemingly have some truth behind them. They're events that are coming out of some form of instability. But unfortunately, those in positions of power take advantage of these events. And then they put regulation in place that slowly, again, as I mentioned, infringes on our ability to show up. And that's a problem that we're facing.
Do you reckon it's with an insidious agenda? Are they evil people that are pushing out these agendas, or they just think that's the best thing for the masses out there and they are actually just trying to take care of everyone collectively instead of individually?
This is a question that I've pondered for a long time, and I've had a few discussions with friends that with varying different backgrounds. And I've always obviously had an interest in psychology. And so one of the ways that I kind of approach it is that I don't tend to believe that there are sinister individuals out there. I think there are people that have done insanely heinous things, but I think that people tend to believe what they're doing is good. And even if you look at, say, let's just take Bill Gates, for instance. Bill Gates, he talks about kind of depopulation, but the reality is, I think that the way he's looking at it is, well, maybe our world cannot support this many people. And so in the long term, this is something positive. And so people can spin things however which way they want to make themselves feel good about their decisions. And I would also say, even look at Hitler. I think some of the decisions Hitler has made in the past, although most of us do not agree with those decisions, from his perspective, he felt what he was doing was right. And so I don't necessarily think people are intentionally being sinister, but I think that ultimately their decisions have a great impact on society. And what we're seeing, like in society today, is there's a report that comes out yearly by a company called, I think it's a nonprofit called Freedom House. And they look at kind of totalitarianism, authoritarianism, controlling structures in society. And what we have seen over the last 16 years is democratic decline. And now 80% of countries globally are not free, which means that only 2 out of 10 people globally live in a so-called free country. And what I would say is, even those 2 out of 10 people, that includes countries like Canada. Canada had the trucker rally, people had their bank accounts freeze for simply protesting. So if that's deemed a free country, I think we've got a very skewed idea about what free means.
Yeah. So what would be your definition then of freedom? What's freedom mean to you on an individual basis, Seb?
You know, it's interesting. I think when you take a look at, say, like the US Constitution, and we talk about things like free speech and property rights, I think freedom to me is someone who has the capacity to have property rights. Freedom to me is also someone who has the capacity to have freedom of speech. And unfortunately, in the world at which we live in, we don't have either of those things. Even in a country like the US that is supposedly built upon freedom of speech, we don't have freedom of speech, because you're seeing during the pandemic, if you simply mention something that is against the mainstream narrative, you had your profile blocked, you were ghost, what is it called on Twitter? You could be like ghost blocked. You don't even know you're being blocked. You're just not seeing any traction in any of your posts. And so I think the world at which we live in today, unfortunately, we have got so much debt, we've got so much instability that if the system collapses, those in positions of power lose their power. So they increasingly infringe upon our freedom of speech, our property rights, our ability to show up, our ability to do anything which infringes upon those in positions of power.
I want to dive into how the financial system looks like it is on the brink of collapse and how long they can kick the can down the road. But just on this topic, I was listening to a really brilliant podcast with yourself, Danny Knowles and Peter McCormack. You're all there in person. And you're talking about during that time of 2020, you had to escape Canada. You jumped in your car, you drove somewhere. I thought that was a fascinating story. So it's not a hypothetical situation you're talking about. It was an experience, a lived experience that you went through. What was that journey? Where'd you go in your car? Why'd you do it? And what was the reason behind running away from a place that you absolutely love?
It's interesting you bring that up, because this story I haven't shared too many times, and I think it's something that deeply changed, I think, the world, the way I look at the world, and that is that I went into the pandemic genuinely believing that okay, I'll reframe. I went into the pandemic realizing that, hey, we had some like structural financial issues. There was instability. I'd watched a few of these documentaries, whether it's like Fahrenheit 9/11 and stuff, where you realize, man, there are some dark things that definitely do happen in the world. But I didn't realize how the trajectory at which the world was on. And when the pandemic really hit, it quickly became aware to me that the world at which we're living in, when those in positions of power are threatened or they want to garner control, they will go to extreme measures. And what we saw in Canada is they started to try and push through bills which basically said anyone who is unvaccinated can no longer purchase groceries. And I was like, what? Like, how can you basically say that you can't eat? Like, that's just mind-blowing. That's extreme lack of freedom. That's extreme censorship. And so ultimately, it had me questioning, like, Canada is this place for the environment, the mountains, the forests, the lakes. There's nowhere else I'd rather be. But in terms of the politics, I wanted to be as far away from Canada as possible. And so I watched this bill starting to go through, and it went up to, I believe, the Supreme Court. And at that point, I was like, if this goes through, I can't eat. And I was stuck because the US at the time were not letting in anyone who is unvaccinated. They were only letting in people that are vaccinated, or if you were unvaccinated, you have to have a medical exemption. And so, long story short, I ended up getting a medical exemption and managed to flee Canada straight into the US. And then I beelined it. The moment I got into the US, I beelined it straight down to Mexico, given that Mexico at the time was kind of far more conservative and open in terms of society. And I know quite a few people that had fled to kind of Mexico. So I went down to Mexico, and then immediately that bill that went through, the Supreme Court were just like, nah, you cannot do this. This is like evil. And so I was just like, nice, that's amazing. And then the US came out and basically said, as of this, at the time, I should say, this was about the 26th of December, I think it was. And on the 31st, they basically said, as of the 31st, you're no longer allowed to enter the US with a medical exemption. And so I'm down in Mexico. I've got my Husky, I've got my car, and I'm just like, frig, I've got to either drive back to Canada right now or just commit to Mexico. And my Husky is like a winter friggin' snow dog. and we're in like 35 degrees. And so I was just like, you know what? I got to go back to Canada. So I drove all the way down to the tip of the Baja, and then I spent 2 days there and drove all the way back. And so that one of the longest drives I've ever had, but it made me really realize how much the political environment basically dictates whether or not you're going to live long term in a country. And that's scary.
Yep. And now when you're thinking, like, it feels like in so many ways we're being pre-programmed for the next pandemic. Whether it happens or not, that's a different story. But it looks like we're slowly marching towards that. And maybe that's like hyper-focusing, living in an echo chamber. I'm not sure. We won't know until it happens. But through that experience that you went through, would you do it differently next time, or did you learn a couple of lessons? So if the proverbial shit hits the fan again, you're like, here's my grab bag, this is where I'm going, this is what I'm doing, or are you just going to make it up on the fly again?
So maybe I'll rephrase the question slightly, in that I think the challenge that I'm facing, and I've spoken to a lot of friends about this, is that there's a decision. Do I leave and go to a country that is maybe more favorable? Let's take El Salvador. Bitcoin is now El Salvador. El Salvador has adopted Bitcoin. We have seen much more favorable legislation put in place. So in terms of freedom, El Salvador at the moment is kind of leading the way. And Canada, I'd say, is like very far behind El Salvador. But in terms of the environment and the community, I built a community here in Canada, and I love the environment. I love the mountains. And so there's this question, which is, do I just constantly respond with fear and flee to where is potentially offering me a safe haven? Or do I stay in the country and actually stand up for what it is that I believe in? And what I think we need to do as a community, especially if we've got a large enough community, which Canada has got an immense Bitcoin community, is I tend to lean now towards the idea that I don't want to respond with fear. I'd rather actually stay true to my values and fight not in a violent sense, but more fight for my values, fight for my freedom, fight for freedom of speech. Because I think if everyone who is fleeing are the people that are very pro-freedom, well, then Canada is going to quickly decline. And unfortunately, that trajectory, or I should say, I don't want to see that happen, because this place is one of the most incredible places I've ever lived.
Yeah. I really feel the same about Australia as well. This place is just absolutely glorious. We've got the Great Barrier Reef literally right there, rainforest. It's absolutely stunning. Same thing. The politics, what's going on there, a little bit concerning. And it's nice to be able to have the option and a second passport, which is great. But that's like plan B. I think staying here and fighting, talking up your beliefs, sharing those beliefs, having platforms that's good with Elon Musk. It's allowing us more freedom of speech. We've got the E-Safety Commissioner here in Australia trying to prevent that freedom of speech if it differs from the mainstream media narrative. But currently we still have it. And while we have a voice, I think it's really important to share our own beliefs. And our own beliefs may be wrong, they may be right, but it's nice to be able to have discord and challenge these. Let's move into chapter 11, Behind Closed Doors of the books, how unelected organisations govern global finance. I can name a few. We've got the World Economic Forum, the Bank of International Settlements, International Monetary Fund, even the Federal Reserve in the US. How do unelected organisations govern global finance?
When we look at the world through the eyes of kind of the average individual, I think we believe we are under this kind of democratic system where we obviously elect those that we believe in, and they kind of work their way up, and then we find prime ministers, politicians, you name it, that are supposedly elected by the individuals, and decisions are made by those individuals. But unfortunately, on a grand scale, on a macroeconomic scale, we have a lot of these unelected organizations that have zero oversight. And those organizations are the ones that you've just mentioned. You've got the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. You've got the kind of the World Bank. You've got the Bank of International Settlements. You've got the World Health Organization. A lot of these organizations, they don't have elected individuals through this kind of democratic process. Instead, they're kind of behind the curtain, and they have immense influence. And so let's just take the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And I should start by saying, if you haven't listened to Alex Gladstein, I would go check out his books first and go and listen to him on podcasts. Whatever you can find, he is phenomenal and does an incredible job at kind of explaining what is happening with the IMF and a lot of these kind of unelected organizations. But long story short, the IMF was founded kind of in the when was it, 1920s, 1930s, and the whole idea behind the IMF was we want to be able to try and support the developing countries, because who else is going to support them? And so they came out with this big plan of supporting developing countries. And so what do? Well, when a developing country finds itself in political unrest, when it finds itself in economic instability, well, the IMF steps in and bails out these countries. Now, that sounds amazing until you realize that, first off, when the IMF comes in, usually what they do is they overshoot how much money these countries need to borrow. And so these countries then struggle to pay back that loan and become more and more and more indebted. And then ultimately, when they default on that loan, the IMF steps in and says, hey, you know what? You can't service your debts. You've got to kind of pay up, either allow us political control. And usually they put US elected, or the US has very much a lot of say as to who gets put in positions of power, or they allow the US to put military might in their country, or alternatively, they sell off a lot of the natural resources to big US corporations. And so a lot of these countries that have had interference through the IMF ultimately have just been corrupted over time. And so you see I wonder if I can find a couple examples. When you actually go back throughout history, and most countries that have had any form of support from the IMF are far worse off than they were prior to the support. And you've also got to think about the fact that, hey, if you're borrowing money, at some point, given that you have to pay back interest plus principal, you're actually paying back more money than you initially borrowed. And so in the last 40, 50 years, we have seen trillions and trillions of dollars leave developing countries and move towards developed countries simply in just interest payments. And so a lot of individuals are like, hey, these unelected organizations are supporting these developing countries. This is phenomenal. They're lending money. What they don't talk about is the fact that any form of loan means more money is going to leave that developing country in the long run. And so I personally lean more towards a free market, whereby if you have a country that has economic instability, it's because of fiscal mismanagement. And if you allow that fiscal mismanagement to break down, then you allow someone else to rise up who is going to be fiscally responsible. And so ultimately, in the long term, you end up with better fiscal responsibility. You end up with better structural support, stability. And so ultimately, I believe that the IMF creates more instability than it creates stability.
Well, I think we're a really good example of somebody stepping in and fixing it is Nayib Bukele with El Salvador. A couple of interesting things there. Obviously, it wasn't just Bitcoin, but he adopted Bitcoin and it's done really well for him, which is great, even though the mainstream media, when it was down, gave him a lot of negative press. They're absolutely silent now that it's back in the black. So that's one thing, but he came in there and he cleaned up the country with the crime, highest murder capital in the world to the safest in the Western Hemisphere. So that's good. But what I found really interesting was the IMF said, hey, you stop buying Bitcoin. He's like, no, we're going to keep doing it. And they've sort of backtracked a little bit, but they're almost dictating to a sovereign nation that they can't buy Bitcoin. That seems a little bit sinister and insidious to me. Whether they believe in Bitcoin or not, that's not really on them. El Salvador is its own nation state.
It's an interesting point, which is the fact that when you look at El Salvador and El Salvador adopting Bitcoin, El Salvador has since been able to start paying down, and it may have even paid down its debts to the IMF. This is one of the first countries that's ever been able to do this. And it's been able to do this because it's been saving in an appreciating asset. Plus, it's had a lot of capital come into the country by offering a favorable kind of locale for people to move to. Now, what I find is fascinating is if El Salvador is shown as a success story, and all of a sudden you start to see all these other nation states start to adopt Bitcoin, well, that's a massive threat to the US. And so the US does not want to support anything that is going to threaten their hegemony globally. And you also see this happening in the US, whereby her name is Caitlin Long, who is very much involved in kind of the legislative space of Bitcoin and very vocal in how we can move forward into a world where maybe Bitcoin adoption is kind of front and center. But she has talked a lot about Custodia Bank, and there's one other, and I've forgotten the name off the top of my head. But these two banks, their whole goal is, hey, we want to have a banking system which is not fractionalized. We want to have a banking system where if you deposit $100, we're going to hold $100 in reserves. And so you've got 100% collateralized reserves in your bank. And that means that the bank, in theory, cannot fail because it will always be able to support its depositors if they request their money back. Now, what is interesting is when this bank, Custodia, and this other bank went to the Federal Reserve and the SEC asking for kind of approval, they got rejected. And they got rejected because ultimately, if there is a safer bank option on the market, then people are going to flee traditional banks into that safer option, which causes economic instability. And so you almost see that because we're on this path of intervention, we're on this path of economic instability, we almost can't even support stable options because it's a threat to the current system.
That's probably like a good slip into chapter 7, short-term thinking equals long-term problems, how our money impacts governments and politics. But just in regards to like the short-term thinking, with Caitlin Long and Custodia Bank, I believe it was like an official press release, whether it was from the Fed or the SEC or whoever the governing body was, that having that would create bank instability, which is crazy. Giving someone a safer option would allow people to wake up to the house of cards, the fugazi that's going on. But this conversation about short-term thinking, long-term thinking in regards to the money, politics, the way that the systems run, how's it play out? And why don't they align? Like if someone's got a short-term focus, they're not looking at the future. And I guess why can't we have both?
I would say when we're thinking about kind of long-term versus short-term, the world at which we live in incentivizes certain behavior. And I think people sometimes don't necessarily recognize just how much to what extent we are a product of our environment. And so the challenge with short-term thinking is when we're short-term thinking, we're only ever trying to meet our immediate needs, which is obviously going to impact our future, given that we're focusing on our immediate needs, which may not necessarily benefit our future self. And so when we look at money, money is one of these kind of levers which greatly influences how we see the world. Because our money is losing value over time, what ends up happening is it incentivizes us to consume, given that our purchasing power is declining as time goes by. And so this incentivizes us to think short term as opposed to thinking about that long-term economic stability or prosperity or security. Now, that's on an individual level, but the same is also true for government. If a government has a money printer and is able to fund operations without support from the populace, then it's going to do so. And not only that, but if it has a money printer and it doesn't have to think about saving or doesn't have to plan to the extent that it might have to under a world where if the only way to obtain money is through support from the populace and taxation, then all of a sudden you're going to see government in that same light where they're very short-term and impulsive. And I'll give you an example. Our current monetary system allows the government to be able to fund operations and run massive, massive deficits. And you see that in the health industry. With the health industry, we see immense amounts, billions and billions, if not trillions of dollars, move towards pharmaceuticals and short-term intervention. And the health of the population is not improving. The health of the population is declining. The US has something like 2/3 of the population are metabolically unhealthy, and obesity is just running rampant. And so when you're looking at this, you're like, well, this isn't working. Whereas if you were to flip this on its head and say, okay, you know what? We're moving over to a free market system. We're removing the money from state. So ultimately, the state has to be a fiscally responsible entity. Well, all of a sudden, if it has to balance its books through fear of going insolvent, well, what's it going to do? It's got to think about the long-term health of its population. So how does it do that? It looks at the health that we've currently got and the trajectory we're on, and it has to do something different. So rather than intervening and pumping trillions of dollars into pharmaceuticals, which are clearly not working, we would probably look at, well, we want to try and educate schools. We want to teach people about why health is important. People need to get out in the sun. They need to go and frickin' do sports, you name it. And I think we would see a big shift towards doctors, educational institutions focusing on health, nutrition, psychology, and relationships as opposed to just pharmaceuticals. And that is a long-term approach because in the short term, it takes a lot of energy, but in the long term, it's far more efficient. And so that's kind of just one example how our monetary system is shaping whether or not we are thinking short term or whether or not we're thinking long term.
With the current money system, the fiat money system as it is, do you see that changing at all? Like, can things get better if they're just to continue with the fiat system that we have at the moment?
I don't believe so. And you can look at the math to be able to prove that. In that, let's just take Canada, where I live. Canada has 422% debt to GDP. And so for those who aren't familiar, Canada has 422% debt to GDP. And we're now the most indebted nation as a percentage of debt to GDP globally. And so when we look at those numbers, some people will be like, oh, but I thought it was like 100 and something percent. What they're often forgetting is that most of the time, when we quote debt to GDP, we're quoting just government debt. We're not talking about household debt and corporate debt. So when you take into account household debt, credit cards, mortgages, corporate debt, companies, the debt that corporations hold, and government debt, Canada is at 422% debt to GDP. Now, of that debt, we obviously know that when you have a debt, you also have interest payments. Now, let's just take an average interest rate, a conservative average interest rate of 3%. I think it's quite a bit higher, but let's just take 3%. If we multiply 3 by 422%, we basically get 12.66. So that's 12.66%. So that means that we have to be able to grow GDP by 12.66% just for us to be able to service the interest on our debt. And so when we talk about our current monetary system and whether or not we can change the trajectory we're on, I would say we cannot unless we go through a major either economic collapse or a huge restructuring with immense amounts of austerity. Because the trajectory we're on, we're not even able to service our debt payments, given that if you look at Canada over the last 100 years, we haven't been growing anywhere near 12.66%. The average GDP growth over the last 100 years has been 0.61%, not even 1%. And so we're not even close. And this is the same in the US. I think it is 267% debt to GDP. I'm not sure what it is in Australia. In the UK, we're well over 250% debt to GDP. And globally, we're at 55% debt to GDP or something similar. And so what you realize is that our monetary environment is pushing us or backing us into a corner.
Yeah. So on that thread, if they're not going to change anything, and I understand Bitcoin fixes this, but not everyone gets Bitcoin. So they're not awake to the life raft. For people that are staying within that fiat financial system, what can you see playing out for them in their lives? Do things get harder? Do they start experiencing hyperinflation? Do house prices keep going up? Does electricity prices keep going up? Like, how's it play out?
When we look at the deterioration of money, that is obviously going to greatly impact society and what you've just mentioned. Like, people are going to start to experience cost of living crisis. People are going to struggle to be able to put gas in their cars. Like, even when I look at the cost of living today versus 10 years ago, it just blows me away. When you look at even, say, something like real estate, what we can sometimes struggle to understand is that when money no longer acts as a store of value because money is losing purchasing power over time, well, people aren't simply just going to save in the currency and see their purchasing power deteriorate. Instead, they're going to try and store it in something else. So what do they go and store it in? They go and purchase things like real estate. They go and purchase things like stocks. And so these things start to appreciate immensely. And so, like, where I live in Whistler, a small little ski town in Canada, I've seen house prices go from the average house 15 years ago was 800,000. Now that same house is 4 million. And so what you're starting to see is people just flooding all of their capital into real estate. And many times these people aren't even using the real estate for their intended purpose, which is to house their family. They're simply using them to store capital. And so again, where I live, 61% of houses are empty. We're also seeing the same thing with farmland. Farmland is being bought up left, right, and center. But these wealthy individuals are not using it to plant crops and support the local community. Instead, they're using it simply to store value. And so farmland is going up. Farmers are unable to kind of be as profitable as they once were. So many of them are having to flee or look at subsidies in order to be able to kind of survive. And so what we're seeing is the degradation of society. Food is rising, gasoline prices are skyrocketing, house prices are skyrocketing, and all of these are a byproduct of a broken monetary system.
Thanks, Satoshi, for Bitcoin. I think we better bring in a little bit of positivity before we do that. The hidden cost of money, I thought of a good way to be able to give a giveaway. It is signed by Seb to the reader as well. I think the best way to be able to give this book away is leave a comment at the bottom of this video, but also share this video on X and tag both Seb and myself on X with the video, and a takeaway. Be intelligent about it. What is something that you like, or what is a question that you'd either like to ask Seb or myself? Do that, and we'll find a way to either pick the best one, or we'll do it randomly. And the hidden cost of money, a signed copy, I will send out to you on the post, or chuck in some stickers, maybe a couple of Satoshis as well, which having a lot of fun with is, can't remember the name of the website, so I haven't been able to bring it up on my show, but you can fill a QR code with Satoshis, and you can give someone the QR code and they can scan it, they can get it, or I can show it on my live stream and stuff. And I did it once on my live stream and it was absolutely epic. Maybe we'll chuck one of those in there. But that aside, how Money Reimagined, Chapter 13, how this revamped monetary system may benefit us. How does Bitcoin fix this? Both individually on a Bitcoin standard, things get better pretty quickly. You gain hope, financial freedom, sovereignty back into your own lives. You start taking responsibility for everything. But how's the new system that is money, that is Bitcoin, this magic internet money, fix it?
So I would say that the biggest thing that Bitcoin does is separates money from state. And so all of a sudden, it puts everyone on an even keel. Everyone is on kind of the same playing field. And there's a quote in the book, which is one of my favorite quotes, and that is the founder of Stony Ridge Asset Management once said, Bitcoin is a system built upon rules instead of rulers. And I think that when everyone is playing by the same rules, then what ends up happening is you force collaboration and you force value creation and competition. And that is incredibly important. From a political standpoint, if those in positions of power can only fund operations through support from the populace and through, say, taxation, then all of a sudden, if they're not offering value to the populace, they're going to quickly wither away, and someone who is offering value is going to be able to rise up. That's not the case in our current system, as we've described, because government can fund operations without support from the populace simply by devaluing the currency. And on a personal level, I think that it is profound, the benefits that it can offer. First off, when we think about our time preferences, what we discussed earlier, are we thinking about the long-term future, or are we thinking about the short term? Now, when Bitcoin increases in purchasing power over time, it shifts our incentive. Our incentive is to think about saving, given that our purchasing power is greatest in the future. So all of a sudden, people are going to slow down on consumerism, and they're going to think about their future. What is it that I really want? How do I actually want to show up in this world? What is it that kind of motivates me? And I think that is huge. I think that if people are thinking about the long term and building security, we're going to have a lot more stability in society, and we're going to build a lot kind of stronger communities. And then you also see it on the meaning side of things. When people are able to save and people are able to get ahead, and they can actually set a goal in sight, such as, okay, you know what? I want to buy a property. I want to try and save and put a roof over my family's head. If they've got this appreciating asset that allows them to get closer and closer to the point where eventually they can purchase that property, they will feel a big sense of meaning. Now, at the moment, we're seeing highest rates of suicide, highest rates of anxiety, depression, you name it. And I believe that on a Bitcoin standard, the inverse would be true. We would see much more greater sense of confidence, much lower risk of depression, much lower suicide rates, drug use, you name it, because people would have a lot more fulfillment because they have meaning in life. And lastly, I think that when we think about, say, things like compassion and altruism, in psychology, there's something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And on this kind of hierarchy, you've got at the base, you've got your basic needs, which are shelter and food. Now, you cannot think about anything above shelter and food, such as relationships or like spirituality or self-actualization, until you meet these basic needs. Now, the challenge we have in society today is that our purchasing power is degrading, so that all of a sudden we're struggling to be able to meet our basic needs, put food on the table and a roof over our heads. And so people aren't able to think about community, giving back, compassion, altruism. Whereas on a Bitcoin standard, ultimately, as our purchasing power increases over time, people are going to have greater capacity to not only show up for themselves, but also to show up for others. And I think that is huge. I think that is massive. And so money, ultimately, it changes how we show up as individuals. It's not just this thing we transact with. It changes our ability to be more authentic. And that, I think, is hugely profound.
I completely agree, Seb. With Bitcoin, the adoption's been like grassroots. I'll tell my friends about it. They'll buy some. They read the books. They start to understand it. They put in the proof work. They study it. But it's sort of word of mouth. People come in for number go up. The greed side of things. The people that really dive down the rabbit hole start to think about these type of conversations. But the people that are currently in charge of the financial system have a vested interest in staying in power, staying in control, keeping that system, this dying system, the fiat system, alive for as long as possible. So how's the money and state, or the separation of money and state, actually play out?
I believe that people obviously have an incentive to look after oneself. That's one of the actual benefits of a free market capitalist system, is that people are self-interested. And when we're self-interested and we're motivated, we will do whatever it takes to protect oneself and one's family. Now, our purchasing power falls under that kind of that umbrella. We want to be able to protect our purchasing power because that is ultimately what allows us to pursue the things we want to, support our family, put food on the table. So if you have a society where our purchasing power is degrading very quickly, people are going to look for alternate avenues. At the moment, they're looking for real estate. At the moment, they're looking for equities, bonds, you name it. And if you've got this thing like Bitcoin that is outperforming traditional asset classes, people are going to start flooding into this asset. Now, as that starts to happen, those in positions of power, those nation states that are relying heavily on kind of devaluing the currency in order to be able to fund operations, if more and more capital is fleeing that country into Bitcoin, or fleeing kind of the traditional financial structures that have typically been sapped dry by governance and taxation, I believe that we're going to see a transition whereby money is just going to increasingly flow into Bitcoin. And if you are a nation state, you can try devaluing your currency. It's going to lead to inflation, or you can start to align with your populace, listen to what it is that they want, and actually get on side. And that way, if you want to start getting paid in Bitcoin, cool, then you can do so.
I think we are starting to sort of see that thesis play out. Both Larry Fink has strongly opposed Bitcoin, index money laundering, I believe was his words, and President Donald Trump as well was dead set against Bitcoin last time he was in the White House. Both those two people who have an extraordinary amount of sway over the global population. I guess the way that a lot of people will look to them, and if they've changed their beliefs, they'll question their own beliefs. How has, I guess, both Fink and Trump starting to change the conversation? Is it in a good way, or is it a bad way, or we don't know yet?
You know, there's a scene in The Big Short, and so those who kind of have seen The Big Short may know this scene. And Michael Burry calls up, or I should backtrack. I should say Michael Burry basically takes these shorts on kind of the housing market, betting the housing market is going to go down. And these short positions called credit default swaps, when the market starts to go down, the credit default swaps aren't paying out. And he's like, what is going on here? So he calls up Goldman Sachs and says, like, look, what is happening with these things? The housing market's collapsing and my credit default swaps aren't paying out. And they were just like, oh, okay, well, we'll have a look into it. And then they call him back a couple of weeks later and they say to him, like, okay, everything's fine. We've figured it out. And they start going back up again. And ultimately what had happened is Goldman Sachs had come on side. They just needed to unload all of their toxic assets and they needed to get on side. And what I think we're seeing right now is the transition where a lot of these major financial institutions that have once been against Bitcoin have been trying to balance their books, get off toxic assets, get into Bitcoin. They need to be on side for this change in this change in kind of the mainstream beliefs surrounding Bitcoin, given that I think Bitcoin is probably the most inevitable thing that I've ever dedicated my life to. It's the most I've never had so much certainty towards something in my life, even though there is no such thing as certainty. But I think that these people in positions of power are starting to recognize that Bitcoin is not going away. And so if you want to be able to benefit from Bitcoin, well, you've got to get on side.
Yeah. I think we're going to see more and more. So who's the first country to print or debase their currency for Bitcoin?
That's a tough one. You know what? I would even say that El Salvador, because they're on the US dollar, they can't do that. I would say that it wouldn't surprise me right now if we have already seen, if many countries are already doing this, or even one or two countries are doing this, and we're just not gaining any clarity. I remember going to a talk with Jeff Booth in Vancouver. This was maybe about a year ago, and someone in the crowd asked him, "Can you tell us who in these positions of power are kind of buying Bitcoin or on side?" And he said, "You know what? I can't give any names, but what I will say is that there are people in the highest of positions that are purchasing Bitcoin, are very pro Bitcoin. It's just they cannot come out publicly because I think that given the instability we see in our current financial system, if you suddenly saw major institutions, the Federal Reserve, central banks globally coming forward saying, hey, we're pro Bitcoin, we're going to buy Bitcoin, I think that could be the death knell to a lot of the debt-based TradFi system.
Yeah. It'd be a race to zero with the money printer for countries worldwide. Little bit of fun, little bit of speculation. Germany, they dumped 50,000 coins, 49,900, whatever it was, onto the market. Came down, bounced back up. Then we've got the Mt. Gox sell pressure coming on. It's going to be released. But then on the other hand, it's about 140,000 coins that could potentially be sold. I don't believe they're all going to be sold. And then FTX creditors are going to get about $16 billion back in cash. So some things will weigh out, some won't. But then 90% rate cut expected in September. Maybe money printing. We're going into the election cycle, the biggest election cycle, the most important election cycle, the US elections later this year. I don't really care about the numbers. Bitcoin's going up and to the right forever. But sort of what do you see playing out? Do we just like rocket it straight up, or do we get more volatile, or it does nothing? How are you sort of seeing the next 6, 12, 18 months?
Honestly, you know what? When I first moved out to Canada and I started teaching mountain biking, I realized that in order to be able to get ahead, I had to have passive income streams. And so I started looking into real estate, I started trading in the financial markets, and I started off day trading. And it was the most stressful thing I'd ever done in my life. It used to give me like headaches. I used to wake up at 5 a.m. just trying to predict where I thought the market was going to go. And over time, what I noticed is that my time preference lengthened from kind of short intraday positions to weekly positions, to monthly positions, to yearly positions. And when it comes to Bitcoin too, as you've just mentioned, I've never had so much certainty towards something in the long term. But in the short term, I do believe that we are going to see a lot higher prices than we have today, even in the next year and a half. But it's so tough to predict these things. Yeah. And I think that if the government and those in positions of power do want to suppress Bitcoin's price in the short term, I do believe they can do so if they're not already doing so.
Yep. I think they can to an extent, and I have the same belief personally, but the reason why I like speculating or look into the prices or even discussing other people's price predictions is when number goes up, it is the number one marketing tool. It brings a whole new cohort back into Bitcoin, and that's what we need. We need people to understand it. This is the most important technology that's ever existed. It's the one tool that I've found to be able to give you financial freedom, sovereignty, independence, to be able to have a grab bank, to be able to have choices in life. It changes everything. But, come in for the number go up, people come for the greed, and then they stay for the revolution. And that's why I love talking about it so much, because when the number pumps, people get all excited, people come in there, and the education within the Bitcoin space now is on fire. There's podcasts, and we're going to transition a little bit into something that you, Seb, and Greg Foss have been doing with Looking Glass Education. But there's so many resources. There's books, podcasts, tweets, articles, even mainstream media to an extent, and especially when the price is pumping, cover it.
Well, I would say, I would say that in the short term, it's very hard to predict where Bitcoin is going. But in the long term, the way that I look at Bitcoin is that when we have a society, which we do, that is constantly trying to innovate, constantly trying to get more for less, we see technology advance. Now, technology should be advancing, allowing our prices to fall, but we don't realize that because our currency, unfortunately, is losing purchasing power quicker than we're advancing technology. And so if you have a monetary system that has a fixed supply like Bitcoin with 21 million, as prices advance, or sorry, as technology advances and innovation kind of improves, what ends up happening is prices fall. And if you take the average kind of advancement in technology in most industries, we're looking at prices should be falling around 5 to 15% per year. Let's just take the middle bound of that, 10%. Well, how does that compare to real estate? How does that compare to equities? How does that compare to bonds? Well, equities have been going up on average around kind of 7 to 8% over the last 100 years annualized. Bonds have been going up around 5 to 6% annualized over the last 100 years, and real estate has been going up around 6 to 7%. So if you have a monetary system like Bitcoin that has got a fixed supply and its price should be advancing by around 10% because of innovation and technology, that's out-competing all of the traditional markets. Well, how much money is in those traditional markets versus Bitcoin? Well, Bitcoin is worth around $1.5 trillion, the total market cap of Bitcoin. Whereas when you're looking at bonds, you're looking at something like $300 trillion. When you're looking at equities, you're looking at $150 trillion. When you're looking at real estate, another $250 to $300 trillion. The derivatives market alone is $1 quadrillion or $1,000 trillion. So we're talking about unbelievable sums of money that are in these traditional asset classes simply to protect purchasing power. And Bitcoin is worth $1.5 trillion, which means these are hundreds of times larger than Bitcoin. And I truly believe that if Bitcoin is able to sustain its trajectory, we're going to see hundreds of trillions of dollars leave these traditional asset classes and move back into Bitcoin. And that's obviously a long-term kind of shift. But that's where when people say, well, what could Bitcoin go up? Another 50%, another 100%? We're talking tens of thousands of percent.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Peter Dunworth, when I sat down with him at Bitcoin Alive, he said, there's more upside in front of us than there is behind us. And he explained it. Everyone go check out that video with it. But it's possible and probable. Maybe it's just math. Maybe it's just a matter of time. Over what time frame? Does it matter? It's the cheaper it is for the longer, the better it is for everyone. So yourself, Seb, Daz Bea, and Greg Foss have put together or co-founded Looking Glass Education. It's a free platform educating people that come into the space who've gone through the first course that you had there. As the number invariably goes up, we are going to have people. So I think this is a really good resource. Could you explain what it is? And for everyone watching, whether you've been in Bitcoin for 1 day, 1 year, 10 years, it's well worth taking the time to go through the learning platform.
For sure. And so we founded Looking Glass with one goal in mind, and that is to speak to the average individual. If there is someone who's interested in philosophy, you've got Breedlove. If you want to dive into the corporate side of things, you've got Michael Saylor or Antonopoulos for the technical side of things. But we felt that there wasn't enough content that really spoke to the layperson, the working kind of blue collar. And so we created Looking Glass with that goal in mind. And all of our content is free and accessible. We started out with what's called our free foundations course. And that's more about macroeconomics. It's like, how does our current system function? What is the evolution of money that led us to where we are? And what are our solutions to kind of protect ourselves as working individuals? And that was, it blew us away with just kind of the success of that course. So we ended up building out a second course, which is the Beers for Bitcoin book. And that kind of discusses how Bitcoin kind of came to be, Bitcoin's inception, as well as how Bitcoin actually functions, blockchain technology, public-private key cryptography, and then it dives into how, as an individual, can you get involved, whether it's investing in Bitcoin, whether it is running a node, whether it is mining. And then what we realized is that these two courses that we've created, whether it's about Bitcoin or macroeconomics, are something that everyone needs along their learning journey. And so we lumped them together and we created kind of our Bitcoin course, and it kind of dives in all of that. And so at the moment, if you go onto our website, you can find that. And we also have a ton of other resources, whether it is short form posts, whether it is long form blogs, whether it is the podcast that the team have been on. But we, more than anything, we just want to be able to support people in their learning journey.
100% concur. Everyone should check it out. And that Beers for Bitcoin have given this book away more than any other book. I think it should be the first orange pill book. It's so easy, so simple. 4, 6 hours, 8 hours to read if you're a slow reader. It's just such a great resource. This one's signed by Daz. I'm waiting for your signature in there. But check it out. Read the books, eat the bugs. Free education, Looking Glass education. All the links are below. Make sure that if you want a signed copy, you reach out to us, leave a comment below, and share this video on Twitter. But I'm going to give the floor over to you, Seb. What is the message that you'd like to impart with the readers today?
I would say that, like, more than anything, Bitcoin education shouldn't be behind kind of a price barrier. And so even with my book, The Hidden Cost of Money, if you prefer a physical copy, then by all means go and purchase that physical copy. But if you're listening to this and you're not in the financial position to go and purchase that book, just reach out to me at just Seb Bunney, Bunney, on Twitter, and I'm more than happy just to send you the ebook for free. Because I truly believe that as a community, we realized how incredible Bitcoin and a future on Bitcoin may be. And I don't want price to be a barrier for someone to understand that. And I think that as a community, it's our kind of duty to kind of help support others in their educational journey.
Mate, what an absolute pleasure. For everyone watching, hit subscribe if we vibe and watch this video with Daz that's on screen right now. Cheers.